It isn't a disaster in the making. It's a disaster made worse.
Hackers backed by the Russian state are trying to steal COVID-19 vaccine and treatment research from institutions around the world.
The World Health Organization has reported a massive surge in cyber attacks amid the COVID-19 pandemic, and hospitals are prime targets.
We're continuing to see nation-states engaging in activities to steal information or even disrupt activities related to COVID-19 response, the development of treatments for the virus, and especially concerning the development of vaccines to combat the virus.
In the first few years leading up to the pandemic, we saw the rise of separate cyber and data regimes coming from countries like China, India, Russia, and the United States that began to impact data flows and really increase cyber risks. If you have country governments that have different approaches to data privacy standards, you're going to have conflicting regulations.
In cyberspace, there are no borders, and the population of the virtual world only continues to grow. Expansion of 5G networks could bring 1 billion more people online in the next few years, along with their devices and data.
One of the things that COVID-19 has really done is it has accelerated the adoption of digital technologies around the world. Our CEO, Satya Nadella, recently said that Microsoft saw 2 years of digital transformation occur in just 2 months. And we've seen incredible engagement online, video communication, as the world has really isolated in reaction to this pandemic. And they found that they can continue to converse, they can continue to learn, they can continue to engage in business transactions online.
We need a formal convening of both governments and global internet powers to account for the changes happening in the cyber realm and to build pathways toward convergence of norms necessary for governments, individuals, and companies to continue to freely and safely interact.
Just as the world discovered that it could not prevent the scourges of war unless there were international rules to govern what happened on land and on the sea and in the air, we now live in a world that requires that we have established rules for cyberspace as well.
21st century problems require 21st century solutions to protect healthcare systems, vaccine development, critical infrastructure, and democracy itself.
The way that we interact with each other online is going to be ever more critical. And without a common understanding and acceptance of the rules of the road in cyber behavior, such onward progress is not going to be accessible, not to the individual, not to societies, not to our companies, and certainly not to our governments. Hello, everyone. I'm Meredith, Sumpter, CEO of the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism and Eurasia Group advisor. Welcome to Digital Peace, Trust and Security in Cyberspace, a GZERO media live stream in partnership with Microsoft and Eurasia Group. Over the course of the next hour, we'll talk about a few of the key themes you just heard mentioned in the video introduction. The growing threat of cyber attacks and cyber warfare, how the pandemic has exacerbated that threat, and the public and private partnerships it will take to create comprehensive governance of the digital world. To start us off, I'm joined by Tom Burt, Corporate Vice President for Customer Security and Trust at Microsoft, and Marietje Schaake, International Director of Policy for Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center and President of the Cyber Peace Institute. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Marietje, I want to start by setting the scene for viewers. First, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said, digital technology is shaping history, but there's also a sense that it's running away from us. In the context of this discussion, Marietje, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think it's clear that the technology is developing at the speed of light. People are adopting it now in new ways, especially because of the pandemic, but also in general, the uptake of new systems is often more quick than the ability of democratic governments to come to clear rules, guidelines, norms, and clarity in the diplomatic sense between countries on what's responsible behavior, for example, and what the consequences would be when there are such very cynical type of attacks that were just shown in the video. attacks on civilian infrastructure, criminal activity, attacks for geopolitical gains. In a way, more connectivity leads to more vulnerability. And I think that the idea that the momentum is now and should not slip away from us is hopefully what Secretary General Guterres meant, is that we have a responsibility now to make sure that the rules-based international order also applies to the digital world, so that there is accountability, so that the public good is protected, and so that especially those most vulnerable populations, like patients in hospitals or people who are impacted by such attacks, are front and center of what it is we're trying to achieve together.
Tom, obviously cybersecurity has been a rapidly growing concern even before the pandemic. What were the biggest threats prior to 2020, and how is the pandemic impacting those threats?
Well, over the decade before 2020, we just saw a continuous escalation in the volume and sophistication of cyber attacks. In the realm of nation-state attacks, we saw those begin with espionage, the theft of data and information, that expanded to the theft of intellectual property and large data sets, and then ultimately graduated, as it were, to attacks that were intended to just cause damage and harm, like the 2017 attacks, the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks. But what we've continued to see is escalation both in the number of nation states engaging in these attacks and the frequency and volume and sophistication of the attacks. And we can't lose sight of cybercrime attacks, which continue to grow at incredible rates without any meaningful deterrence or reduction in the rate or sophistication of those attacks, which are taking billions of dollars out of the economy and harming consumers and enterprises. So what we've seen, though, from the pandemic, as was mentioned in the video, is we've seen this incredible transformation as people have moved home and yet continue to work or go to school or interact virtually. And that has greatly expanded the volume of activity on the internet in ways that all of the private sector scrambled to stay on top of and make sure that we could provide those services. But that also means more opportunity for those who wish to take advantage of the situation for cybercrime or other nefarious purposes. And we saw a couple of big trends. The first was we saw a significant increase in COVID-19 themed attacks. So the principal way in which adversaries will attack and try to get on your computer is through phishing. And the way that you phish is you provide a lure, some information in an email or in a communication that causes the recipient to click on a link and thereby infect their computer with the malware of the attacker. And we saw not an increase in the total number of attacks, but we saw a transformation in the lure that was being used from other social issues or other topics to COVID-19 themed topics. And there were big spikes in that effort that corresponded with the degree to which the pandemic was getting public attention. And the data there was really interesting. The other thing that we've seen, unfortunately, is we've seen a significant increase in attacks on healthcare providers. That's cyber criminals using ransomware to go after hospitals or other healthcare providers, as well as nation states who are attacking either to steal information about treatments or vaccines, or even possibly to disrupt the development of those treatments and vaccines. And we've seen all of that in the healthcare sector. Just recently, as some of you may have seen, there was an event a tragic event in Germany when a woman who was going to the hospital to get emergency care had to be turned away because the hospital was the victim of a ransomware attack that shut down all of their services. And she had to go to a different hospital, and unfortunately, she passed away. And that's really the first time that we've been able to identify clear, direct human harm. We've seen humans put at risk in the past, but now we're seeing direct human harm, and the disruption of the efforts to try to combat the pandemic globally are just other efforts to put humans at risk in the name of either nation state interests or cybercrime. I guess the silver lining to all of that, and I know we'll explore this some more in our conversation, is this is drawing international attention to the urgency of these issues. And to sort of use a medical metaphor, we're starting to see some hints that antibodies are beginning to develop in the international system to push back against this. We've seen governments condemning these kinds of attacks on healthcare facilities and healthcare systems and researchers. We've seen communities of legal scholars looking at this issue. We've seen the United Nations begin to discuss this issue. All of that reinforces the basic message, which is the need to have clear rules of the road and expectations for responsible behavior in cyberspace, and to increase international cooperation among governments and the private sector, both to address those issues and to combat cybercrime.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I just want to bring Marietje back in here because in May, the Cyber Peace Institute called on governments to take immediate and decisive action to stop cyber attacks. So this is one of those antibodies that you were just talking about, Tom, to stop those cyber attacks against hospitals and medical research facilities. Marietje, what has happened since?
Well, it's true that both the attention for these kinds of incredibly cynical and opportunistic attacks has increased. So I do think more and more governments are aware that this is an issue, but I still think that in order to have the proper political debate, there needs to be more understanding among the broader public and among decision makers. So surely people who work in tech companies or who are experts in the field of cybersecurity may have a good sense of what's happening, or may be able to distinguish between phishing, ransomware, intrusion, hacking. But for the average citizen, this is all very, very abstract. And I feel like the lack of humanizing these stories, explaining how it's not so much about technology, but very much about people that are impacted, and creating more urgency for governments to actually act and to begin to attach more firm consequences to those very, very harmful and illegal, criminal, or otherwise motivated attacks is very important, because I think the fact that there's a lack of clarity on norms, on where accountability comes from, on the levels of international law covering some of these questions, especially, when does peacetime spill into war, and when does escalation meet the threshold of real armed conflict as we know it from the offline world? These are big questions, but very significant ones, as some attackers are calculating very carefully how they can significantly harm others. Could be for their own geopolitical position, or for strategic objectives, or to weaken their adversaries, or to obtain critical information. The point is that the calculation is often to stay below known thresholds, because they're basically aware, these attackers, that if they do not overstep a certain boundary, and if they stay in the gray zone where there's not a lot of clarity of what consequences may be expected, they may well get away with it. And frankly speaking, too often that's the case. So it's important to change the equation, to have more of a public debate that's well informed, and then to get better political pressure and leadership, frankly, to close the accountability gap. And that's something that at the Cyber Peace Institute we really work on. And I think the healthcare attacks illustrate why this is so urgent, especially now.
Absolutely. So prior to this live stream, we posted questions on Twitter relevant to our theme to conduct unscientific survey of views on cybersecurity. The first question we asked was, what cyber risk worries you most? The choices were unlawful surveillance, malware and ransomware, cyber theft, or something else. So let's see how people voted. And there we have it. Marietje and Tom, what do you make of these results? And what would you have put at the top of this list?
Well, I'm not surprised that surveillance, and especially unlawful surveillance, comes so high on the list. I think with the book Surveillance Capitalism of Shoshana Zuboff, the idea that business models of very often used online services like social media and search very much rely on data gathering and on building profiles on people has risen awareness to what that means. And I do think that unlawful surveillance and the abuse of vulnerabilities is actually the essence of a lot of cyber attacks, whether then, the vulnerabilities are exploited for dividing ransomware or obtaining access to people's devices to extract information. I think this model that relies on so much connectivity without the proper protection is indeed at the core of why we are so vulnerable. So I would have probably also chosen unlawful surveillance because it's so systemic. Right. Although, of course, it's hard to choose between so many urgent topics that all need to be addressed.
So, Tom, I want to draw your attention quickly to that 11.2% of something else. The name pulled items are things that people think about with regard to cybersecurity, but you think about this topic from a much larger global perspective. What would your something else be?
Well, I think, first of all, I agree with what Marietje just said, absolutely relative to surveillance. Something else, I think one thing that people could be concerned about, and certainly we need to be concerned about, is the growing footprint that's available for attacks that is largely being derived from the prevalence of IoT devices and the incredible expansion that we have seen and the projections for just unremarkably large-scale expansion in connected devices that can bring incredible benefits to consumers and people around the world, but also increase risk. And it requires us to have stronger, better systems for security standardization for these devices really around the world, something that we at Microsoft are working on. I might also just quickly mention, because it is important that we better communicate the human impact of cybercrime and these attacks. And that can be really hard to do. And sometimes very large numbers tend to depersonalize the situation. But just to give you a little bit of data, in 2019, Microsoft Technology blocked over 13 billion malicious emails. And 1 billion of those were specifically set up to try to conduct phishing attacks. And that's what we were able to block. And yet many, many, many were successfully launched, and people were phished and attacked, their credentials stolen, their information stolen. And so this problem is a massive scale problem that has real human impact. Ransomware, I think around the world, we're seeing an explosion in ransomware, shutting down municipal services, shutting down commercial services, interrupting and now shutting down healthcare services. And it's the most common incident response engagement that our teams at Microsoft saw in the past year, and therefore also a huge concern of ours.
Thanks so much, Tom. We're going to shift the conversation now to talk specifically about the current state of laws surrounding cyberspace. And later, we'll touch on possible next steps in the global discussion around creating norms. Right now, I'd like to bring in Dapo Akande, who is Professor of Public International Law at the University of Oxford and co-director of the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict. Welcome, Dapo.
Thank you very much, Meredith.
Great to have you here. We were talking before about how the pandemic has impacted cybersecurity, and you have led an effort by 120 lawyers around the world calling for international laws to protect against cyber threats to healthcare organizations. Share with us, what progress have you made?
Yeah, so our effort was not really an effort to call for new laws, but really it was an effort to say, first of all, international law already applies in cyberspace in the same way that it applies offline. And secondly, to try to set out in summary fashion what the relevant rules of international law are, particularly in relation to cyber operations that are targeting the healthcare sector, the attacks that Tom and Marietje have been talking about. And as you say, we had an incredibly diverse group of leading international lawyers from all around the world agreeing that international law applies and agreeing to some basic rules of international law. And what we have found most encouraging about this effort is that the UN Security Council has twice this year, 2020, discussed the issue of cyber attacks and cyber operations against critical infrastructure. And in both of those discussions, there has not only been a recognition of the fact that international law applies, but there has also actually been some statement that some of the principles that we set out in our Oxford Statement, that's what we called it, the Oxford Statement on International Law Protections against malicious cyber attacks, some recognition that these principles actually exist as a matter of international law. And it's also been encouraging to see over the last couple of years, over the last few years, a significant number of states also setting out their own position in relation to what international law has to say about cyber operations.
So let's take a step back, Dapo. Can you give us a primer on where things currently stand in terms of international laws surrounding cyberspace?
Absolutely. So first of all, let's talk about the process by which we might actually elaborate what these international law rules are. So the United Nations has two groups that are currently looking at responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So this is, first of all, a UN group of governmental experts, and secondly, a UN open-ended working group, both of them looking at this issue. Secondly, let's talk a little bit about the substance. So the first thing, and I think this is really important, is that it has been recognized that international law applies in cyberspace. Why is this significant? It's significant because it means that we don't need necessarily new laws. What we need to do is to work out how the existing rules of international law that we have, how these rules apply to this type of activity. So that's point one. Point two is that international law as it exists prohibits certain types of conduct. So we know that, and states have recognized this, the United Nations Charter applies to the activities of states in cyberspace. What this means is that the prohibition of the use of force that exists in the UN Charter also applies online. And so there are certain cyber operations that might cross that threshold and might be regarded as unlawful uses of force against other states. Thirdly, we know that even if a given cyber operation does not amount to a use of force, even if it doesn't cross that threshold, it might nonetheless be prohibited by a range of rules of international law. For example, it might be contrary to the prohibition of non-intervention. In other words, it might be an unlawful intervention in the affairs of another state. It might be a violation of the principle of sovereignty. In other words, it might be an unlawful attempt to interfere with the inherently governmental activities of states. Thirdly, human rights law applies online in the same way that it applies offline. And so states are prohibited from engaging in operations in cyberspace which would violate the human rights of individuals. And the final thing that I would say is that even when it's not states conducting cyber operations, states have obligations of due diligence, obligations to take steps to prevent operations which might cause serious adverse consequences to other states or to individuals, or which might interfere with the rights of other states. So that's just a summary of some of the rules that apply to these operations.
Dapo, thank you so much. It's a very thoughtful rendering of how we might think about applying existing international law to cyberspace. Tom, I want to bring you in here as well to respond to Dapo's comments, but more so from your perspective, where do you see the gaps or the gray areas, if you will, and the legal framework? And what specifically is Microsoft doing to help bridge those gaps?
Well, first of all, the work that Dapo and the Oxford Group did is very important. And one reason I say that is clearly there's international consensus around the problems with enabling cyber attacks against our healthcare systems, disrupting the provision of healthcare, disrupting the efforts to counteract the pandemic that is so affecting all of us around the globe. And so that gives us the opportunity to really mobilize those who care about these issues to address them in that specific context of the appropriate rules governing nation-state conduct relative to the provision of healthcare. Those principles could then be expanded to other key aspects of our our daily lives, the critical infrastructure issues, the provision of food and water, our democratic and governmental processes and so forth. But there's a real test bed opportunity here with regard to international law and its application to cyberspace in the healthcare context. So we're really optimistic about the opportunity to continue the dialogue there. There are a number of gray areas in this space, even though there does seem to be consensus around the applicability of international law to cyberspace, as Dapo just outlined. But one of the real challenges in this space is it does appear that at least some nation states are willing to violate those principles with some degree of impunity in cyberspace in a way that they might not be as willing to do in the physical realm. And so we need to continue to develop how do we assess and determine accountability and provide deterrence for violation of these international principles. Because today, the recognition that the law applies is an important step, but so far it hasn't proven sufficient to really change the tide in the volume and sophistication of attacks. And these issues also apply beyond nation states to cybercrime issues. In the cybercrime world, we see clearer and applicable laws in each nation. In many nations, there are some that are still working on creating these laws, but there's been great progress around the world in that over the last decade. But what there is not today is the structure and the legal framework for international cooperation to combat cybercrime. Because cybercrime is such a borderless crime, and because it extends frequently across geographic borders, and because law enforcement processes tend to be a very sovereign process in every country, the criminals have an advantage because they can operate with greater impunity when they know that there is not the degree of international cooperation that is necessary to really provide meaningful deterrence. And that's another area where, as a world, we need to work together.
That's exactly right. And I think you spoke very eloquently about that, both you and Marietje earlier in the program, when you spoke about sort of the fragmenting of those cyber norms at a time when we are seeing such a shift to the cyber environment caused by the pandemic and a subsequent rise in the volume of cyber attacks as these actors recognize that they have space to act with impunity, so long as we lack that clear legal framework for cyberspace. But Marietje, pulling you back in here, you've seen this issue from a few different angles as an expert, but also as a member of parliament in the European Union. Why has there been so little progress in establishing a clear legal comprehensive framework for cyberspace?
Well, I think there's a couple of things we need to recognize for context. One is that actually international cooperation is not so easy in these very polarized times on any topic. And I think that it's important to start with a smaller group of like-minded to actually get ahead. And you can see progress there. For example, in the European Union, there's a cybersecurity law that's being, rolled out. And there's other initiatives about vulnerabilities disclosure to avoid the exploitation of those software vulnerabilities for malicious purposes. But I fully agree that there's so much more that needs to be done. And I come back to my previous point, which is if people don't quite understand that the digital is human and that the problem is actually about them and could impact anyone, then it will be really hard to get a political and public debate that is both well informed and leads to the necessary pressure to those governments that need to act. And so perhaps it's helpful also in the discussion to start identifying more clearly where progress can be made as first steps. And so this can be among a group of like-minded countries, groups of like-minded actors more broadly. There's a lot of talk about multi-stakeholderism, but I think multiple stakeholders already have a space in democratic debates and democratic countries, for example. So I would imagine that progress has to come from tangible agreements and not only from an ideal of having a global consensus, which will be hard to achieve anyway. I am hopeful, though, that the United Nations is stepping up to take its role, and hopefully that can also become a more relevant and meaningful platform for some of these discussions on what can be done on the global stage. I think there's still a lot of opportunity for the UN to take a larger role and to see where in different areas some progress can be made also globally. So enough to be done, but let's also be realistic about the challenging times that we live in, and we have to navigate. Without recognizing that, I think a real plan to address some of these issues becomes that much harder.
I fully agree. And your point about nation states having different views of what a cyber norm should be and the treatment of data and information, those are the critical challenges that will be up to our diplomats to see if they can make progress on. But Marietje, you coined it, the digital is human. I think that's a terrific phrase and very true in terms of the experience that human beings are now finding themselves in this more disrupted cyber environment. Dapo, I'd love to go back to you. Cyberspace is made up of state actors, but also non-state actors, right? The private citizens and governments alike. And does that change the way that we need to think about international laws for cyber?
So that's an excellent point, because international law traditionally applies to what states do. And in this sector, as you rightly point out, we need to think about what other actors are doing as well. So here I would make a couple of points. The first point that I would make is that some of these non-state actors, maybe even many of these non-state actors, are state-sponsored. And so they're sort of hybrid in the sense that these are groups which are not within the sort of normal framework of the state, but which states are using. And so we need to have clearer rules, or at least we need to be clearer about the rules that relate to how we tie the activities of these groups to states. And actually, international law already has rules of this type. And we need to think about how we apply these rules to the acts of these state-sponsored entities. The second thing that we need to do when we think about non-state actors is we need to think about the response of states to the activities of these non-state actors. And one of the rules that I talked about earlier is opposite in this respect. So this is the idea that states have obligations of due diligence to take measures which are feasible for them to take to prevent or to stop cyber operations, harmful cyber operations, which emanate from their territory or which use cyber infrastructure that's under their jurisdiction, which is causing harm to others. So the short of it is, yes, we need to pay more attention to how international law is going to apply to the activities of non-state actors in this regard. And we have existing tools that we can deploy to doing this work.
Dapo Akande, thank you so much for your time with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Marietje and Tom are still with us, and I wanted to share a bit of a recent conversation between Microsoft's President Brad Smith and former NATO Commander General John Allen about technology as a geopolitical tool and weapon, and the virtual arms race that it has created. Let's listen in.
A nation's military can remain at the cutting edge of technology only if its own industrial base is at the cutting edge of technology. What do you think the U.S. government and our allied governments need to be doing to ensure that our own technology sectors remain competitive in this space?
Well, we've got to be in the conversation with them. In the past, history has taught us that those countries that were able to insert certain kinds of technologies, not artificial intelligence, but I'm talking about in the previous century, into their militaries that were in large measure disconnected in space and time and in acquisition processes from the private sector. That was a strategic vulnerability we're still living with today. So when we see that the private sector continues to innovate, and we see that the distance between our capacity to develop requirements and the capacity of the private sector to respond to those requirements in a timely manner that time, that distance, that process is frankly so great in democracies, and in particular the United States. I think it is a strategic vulnerability. And in many respects, when China competes with the United States in terms of technology, it isn't really competing with the United States as a government. It's competing with the tech industry and the tech entities that are moving at far higher speeds than the government of the United States can even begin to think about moving. Jim Mattis used to talk about our problem is we can only move at the speed of government. But Microsoft and others, they're moving at a much higher rate of speed with respect to innovation and bringing things to practical application. And so we have got to shorten the distance between the private sector and those entities within the government that will ultimately have to apply these technologies. And that, of course, is the Department of Defense.
That's Microsoft President Brad Smith speaking with General John Allen. Marietje, let's unpack that. Do you see a kind of cyber arms race happening? And what does that look like in practical terms?
Well, absolutely. I think the lawlessness is being exploited in so many ways. It can be through companies that are not taking their responsibilities, or companies that are actually developing the very tools that are used for attacks. It's something that we may not think about every day because, we use devices, or the majority of us use devices for, fun, or for education, or for entertainment, or connecting to family. But there's also companies that are building hacking as a service, intrusion systems, surveillance systems that can extract information covertly from people's devices. And that's a growing market too, where there's not enough regulation. And I agree completely with General Allen, who I think has done extraordinarily important work combining his military expertise and his deep commitment to democracy in unpacking some of these big problems and proposing tangible solutions to make democracy more resilient in light of this arms race that you have highlighted, but also to ensure that democratic governments can continue to take their responsibility and do not see a leaking of power, of agency, of oversight, and of governance going directly to private sector actors. I don't think that will help democracy at the end of the day. In fact, I think it erodes it, and it's a balance that needs to tilt back in favor of democratic governments.
Tom, General Allen points out that governments and private enterprise move at very different paces when it comes to tech development and adoption. Is there room for greater synergy there?
Well, there absolutely is, both in terms of tech adoption, but also on the policy front. And in terms of tech adoption, we're seeing increasingly governments moving their critical workloads to the cloud. And this is actually a way for government to enable more rapid adoption of technologies, whether it's ours or our competitors' technologies, other new technologies that are developed. The advent of cloud computing enables rapid deployment of those new technologies into environments that maybe in the past were more reluctant to move that quickly. So that's one step that can be taken. But I think the general's point, and the more important point here, is there is a unique aspect to cyberspace, which is it is developed, evolved by, and primarily owned by the private sector. And what that means is the private sector needs to act responsibly. We need to accept the social responsibility we have for the impact of our technologies on our consumers, on democratic processes, on the world in general. And we need to work collaboratively with government in every single venue in a multilateral way so that we can get to the right policies, the right legal principles. And I agree completely that this needs to be a shared opportunity. This needs to be a shared responsibility between the private sector and government. We need government to be engaged. We need the private sector to be engaged. We need the opportunity to have both in the conversation, because it's going to take that real collaboration between the private sector, the public sector, and civil society to really evolve the technologies and the rules applicable to the technologies to get us to where we want to be.
You said it greatly, Tom. We've established the scope of the problem and talked about existing international laws regarding cyberspace. Now it's time to look at solutions. And I'd like to include into this discussion Marina Kaljurand, a member of the European Parliament, former foreign minister for Estonia, and former chair of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Marina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And I enjoyed very much listening to the previous speakers.
Marina, before we look to the bigger picture of this issue, I want to ask you specifically about Estonia. Now, in 2007, Estonia suffered a large-scale cyber attack that shut down sites within the country. Tell us a little bit about that and what key lessons were learned there.
Yes, thank you for that question. And that year was remarkable because 2007, I was Estonian ambassador to Russia, which means that I was in Moscow during the cyber attacks. And I'm a lawyer by education. I'm a professional diplomat, which means that in 10 minutes, I had to learn what do DDoS attacks mean and start explaining it to the international community, what was happening in Estonia. But you have to understand that Estonia went online already at the end of 1990. So for 2007, we had been online for more than 10 years. Being online means that we had online voting system, e-government, online police, we had e-taxation. So we had hundreds of services being provided online. And the attacks against e-Estonia were the first time when cyber was used by one country against another country for political reasons. So those attacks did not kill anybody. We did not consider triggering Article 5 of NATO, collective self-defense. But they were disturbing, they were humiliating for a country that considered itself being stellar in the sphere of digitalization. So we learned our lessons, but I think that international community also learned the lessons of having cybersecurity high on political agenda, on cooperation with other stakeholders, which was mentioned by almost all speakers today, cooperation with academia, but cooperation among states and cooperation in international organizations. So cooperation is one of the key words, and having high on political agenda, which means financial resources, which means human resources for cybersecurity.
Well, in fact, Estonia is now considered a leading example for cybersecurity based upon its response to that earlier attack, which is why we're so thrilled to have you on the show and to share Estonia's experience. Marina, beyond national defense systems, what role should multilateral organizations like the UN or even NATO have in shaping the future of cybersecurity?
Well, cyber does not have borders, and it says everything. If there are no borders, international cooperation is crucial. Yes, regional cooperation is very important. Here we're talking to like-minded countries. So being in NATO or being in the EU, it's easy to find a common language. We have the same values, we have the same principles, we have the same understanding of applicability of international law. For example, when I was listening to the previous discussion, then I heard it being said that there is no framework for fighting cybercrime. I do not agree. We have a very good framework. It's the Budapest Convention of the Council of Europe, but not all countries want to accede to that. US is not party to that. China is not party to that. Russia is not party to that. So cooperation among like-minded, cooperation within a regional group is crucial and important, but global cooperation is also very important.
So, Maria, another concurrent global issue is the move toward a technological decoupling between the world's two largest economies, the US and China. And what way could that impact any international efforts to establish governance in cyberspace?
Yes, you asked the question from the US and China perspective, but coming from the European Parliament in Europe, I'd like to bring also the European perspective. Yes, today we're discussing cyber sovereignty, we're discussing digital sovereignty, we're discussing things that we did not discuss a couple of years ago. 2013, we were proud of being global, of having global solutions, and those who were talking about individual sovereignty were shamed by others. But the COVID, the pandemic has shown very clearly that we can't depend only on the third countries. So it's the same debate now starting in Europe and in the European Parliament. How far can we go with digital sovereignty? How far can we go with cyber sovereignty, not becoming too protectionist and not closing ourselves from global markets? Because nobody wants to live in a closed economy, in a closed system. We saw what happened in the middle of March when we all talked about our country's security, health security, cyber security, national security, and put it as a priority. So Europe has learned a lesson. We need to be 27 together. We should not build barriers in between of us. But at the same time, we should not build a barrier between us and others. So we are for economic cooperation. We are for open trade, but we have to stand for our interests.
Yes, and part of it with Europe leading in this space, part of the challenge diplomatically will be how the EU is able to forge ties with the US and China and other major cyber actors that are not yet in accordance with how Europe is thinking about governance of cyberspace. But that's diplomacy and leadership. And we thank you for your time and your thoughts with us on that. Marietje, I want to ask you, listening to what Marina had to share with us, what is the beginning framework, given the challenges that we've just discussed, different views of what that rules-based order might look like? What is the beginning framework for that rules-based order in cyberspace look like to you?
Well, I think it would help to choose an area, for example, war and peace, and then to start with a coalition of like-minded countries that can agree on a set of norms. And of course, there has to be consultation with the academics that Marina mentioned, with the private sector, with civil society, very important, with tech experts. But there also has to be clarity about which role every stakeholder plays. Just by sitting around the table, which is often, the proposition of a multi-stakeholder process, doesn't mean that every stakeholder has the same responsibility. And so I would imagine that better cooperation between democratic nations can go a long way. We have to be upfront about the differences in positions, the differences in philosophies, in values. But it doesn't mean that there cannot be a mutual interest in achieving more predictability, more of those very enabling conditions that Marina also mentioned. If we take another example in trade rules for the digital economy and for data flows, I see a huge opportunity for common ground, even between actors and countries that may not agree on much else, but to have a framework that is enabling instead of, a trade war kind of scenario that we see unfolding, particularly between the United States and China, at the end of the day is a losing game. So while the stakes are rising and while some confrontations are very real, both in the space of attacks and escalation of cyber conflict and in the space of questions about what are the conditions under which we can enter a market and when do we run into national security concerns, for example, should be something that countries can agree on and companies can benefit from in terms of having a level playing field. So I think creating predictability, creating clear standards, but also accountability when those standards are violated are immensely important. And I would suggest starting somewhere with a tangible product or project and outcome, and then building the processes around it is the best way to go, and not to talk hoping that there will be global consensus one day, because I'm afraid that's a little bit too much of an idealistic path.
So excellent point. To recognize the mutual interest in more predictability, recognize the mutual interest in having an enabling framework, which takes convergence. Tom, speaking as someone who leads in these issues for Microsoft, how can private actors play a role in the development of this framework for rules-based order in cyberspace?
Well, I think there are a number of things that private sector can do. And we need the cooperation of the public sector to enable that as well. We have a framework from the 2015 United Nations Statement of Norms that can be expanded upon, it can be built upon and improved through, for example, United Nations efforts. but we need that to be a multi-stakeholder process for the reasons I described earlier. And we've seen some real progress in the multi-stakeholder arena. And I agree with Marietje that we need to find specific things we can go out and accomplish. And one example is the Paris Call with over 1,000 signatories with governments, private sector, civil society. And we're seeing that evolve into these communities of interest that are taking specific aspects of the Paris Call and seeing what can we do to actually drive solutions in these particular spaces. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's the opportunity to do that in the healthcare arena, where there's broad international consensus about what appropriate and inappropriate conduct should be, and then moving that on to, as Marietje said, what are the rules for accountability is a next step that needs to be accomplished in that space. But if we can continue to have multi-stakeholder approaches where the private sector and the public sector, government, civil society, all contribute to finding the solutions, that is an important first step.
Thanks so much. We have one more viewer poll to share. On Twitter, we asked, who holds the greatest responsibility for addressing cyber risks? The choices, of course, were governments, tech companies, global institutions, or all of them equally. Let's take a look and see how people voted. Wow. Marina, I'd love to turn to you first. What are your reactions to these results?
I would have answered governments. Because even if we talk about multi-stakeholder approach, somebody has to be in the driving seat and somebody has to be responsible. And for centuries, forever, governments have been responsible for the security questions. Cybersecurity is different, that it has multi-stakeholders also, they have to be included. But I still think that the central role belongs to governments because they adopt laws, they interpret international law, they talk about, they work in accordance with political norms. So the central role should stay with governments, but all the other stakeholders should also have their important inputs.
Marietje, what do you see as the right balance?
Well, I agree with Marina. I think we have to be careful not to normalize the fact that so much power lies with the private sector here. At the end of the day, that's not good for democracy. It's not good for accountability. Of course, there are a number of companies that are very happy to take responsibility, that are forthcoming and engaging in cooperation with governments, but it's not necessarily the norm in that sense. And so I agree with Marina that I think that governments have a key role to play and also have a key responsibility. It's not only a matter of choice and, are they up for it? It's also a constitutional responsibility. For example, if you think about the monopoly on the use of force, which through this cyber arms race that we previously talked about, and through the fact that private companies build so much critical infrastructure, defend critical infrastructure, are also building offensive capabilities. This kind of erosion of the role of democratic states is already visible, and I think we have to be realistic about it. And when there is public-private cooperation, that there's at least clarity about which role each of the sides plays. So what is a healthy role for the private sector versus what is the healthy role for democratic governments, and to build from there. And I believe that the debate on how to best cooperate could also benefit from that kind of clarity, so that everybody's role and responsibility at the end of the day is clear. Also, when things don't go so well, it's helpful to then know what is the chain of communication, what is the chain of responsibility, and also vis-a-vis the public, the chain of accountability in that sense.
Tom, what are your thoughts on what you've just heard from Marietje and Marina?
You may be surprised to learn that I agree completely with what with both Marietje and Marina just said. There are core responsibilities that have to remain governmental responsibilities. What we're trying to do is encourage governments to seize some of that responsibility and to do that in a multi-stakeholder way, which means that you listen to and you include the private sector, because in this space in particular, getting to the right solutions requires an understanding of the technology, an understanding of cyberspace. And it also requires those of us in the private sector to act responsibly, to understand our social responsibility, and to engage productively with government. But at the end of the day, these rules about what are going to be the rules that govern nation state conduct in cyberspace, that has to be a governmental responsibility. We just want to help government make sure that we get it right and that government engage in these discussions towards finding solutions, which right now we're encouraged that there is progress being made, but we need to make more progress more quickly.
Thanks so much. Marina Kaljurand, we thank you for your time with us today.
Thank you.
Now, in our remaining moments, I want to give Marietje and Tom a chance to offer some closing thoughts on all that we've heard, as well as what comes next. Marietje, first to you, what is your forecast for how the issue of trust and security in cyberspace will evolve globally as we move into this post-COVID order?
Well, unfortunately, I think we're still in the middle of the COVID situation, and it will reveal a lot of challenges that were already there, meaning the reliance on technology will be clear, but the vulnerabilities coming from that reliance are also abundantly clear. And so hopefully a momentum will be created to clarify the roles of each of the stakeholders that we've discussed today. And I think it is a great opportunity to learn about what is at stake, what the risks are. We started this hour with highlighting the very, very harmful and violent, and I think the most cynical thing I can think about is to abuse the reliance on healthcare, the development and the real quest for a vaccine for either national agenda gains through espionage, for example, or for criminal gains through ransomware attacks, or for geopolitical advances, for example, weakening an adversarial power. I really think that it's a new low that should bring together a big group of people who will say, this is where we draw the line. We need to investigate what's happening here, put it better into the public debate in the domain so that we can have a healthy debate and evidence-based policy making towards more responsible behavior, towards norms and eventually laws that people are going to respect. And if not, that there will be real consequences. I think this accountability gap allows for too much illegal behavior, even if the rules may not be very clear on paper. Everybody can see that attacking critical infrastructure or vulnerable populations or civilian targets is a very, very bad thing to happen, and it has to stop.
Tom, I'd love for you to share with us your key takeaway for viewers who have stayed with us through this hour of discussion.
I think it's important to recognize that while there is this critical role for government, and there's a critical role for the private sector, we all need to take steps today to help stop this increase in cyber attacks and cybercrime. And there are things we can all do. We can encourage our governments to show leadership in this space and to move forward with a sense of urgency to address these problems. That's very important. But we can each take steps ourselves. Organizations, governments, businesses can invest in the people and the technology that we need to address the cybersecurity of the ecosystem. Individuals can focus on the basics, like regularly taking on security updates from every vendor. That is going to ensure that you have the most secure technology, doing comprehensive backups, and most importantly, using multi-factor authentication on all your accounts. Our data shows that 99% of all successful attacks over the last year would have been prevented if multi-factor authentication had been utilized on all accounts. But we also need to establish these new rules of the road to make clear what the international principles are and how we're going to assure accountability. And that needs to be a multi-stakeholder conversation led ultimately by the responsibility of government, but with the responsibility of the private sector to contribute in a meaningful way.
Great points. I just want to touch on what I've heard from both of you. This is a multi-stakeholder process that governments do have a special accountability and responsibility. We need to recognize new roles and accountability that is needed in this increasingly fragmented cyber world to be able to piece us all back together. That does it for us today. I want to thank Tom and Marietje for their time with us. And a note to our viewers, you can find more articles and video about cybersecurity and many other global themes at gzeromedia.com/UNGA. I'm Meredith Sumpter. Thank you all for watching and take care.